Welcome back to another lecture. This is historical topic 8.11, the civil rights movement expands, and we're going to be looking at the theme, social structures. The first and only learning objective for today is explain how and why various groups responded to calls for expansion of civil rights from 1960 to 1980. So, we have been talking about the civil rights movement for African Americans in the previous historical topic. Now, what we're going to see is that there's other minorities in the United States who have experienced discrimination throughout the 20th century and even some before the 20th century, and they are going to be using strategies from the civil rights movement and applying it to their own groups. So the first key concept is Latino, American Indian, and Asian American movements continue to demand social and economic equality and a redress of past injustices. And we're going to start with Latinos. They experienced discrimination, and that was fueled by anti-immigrant sentiments. They were able to continue to come into the United States, some through the Bracero program and some informally crossing the border as birds of passage, working in the United States, mostly in agricultural fields, and then going back to Mexico in the off-season. As more and more Mexican Americans were coming into the United States, there was a sentiment that fewer of them needed to be in the United States, and so the United States government went through in 1954 with Operation Wetback. Now, wetback is a derogatory term for anyone crossing the border illegally from Mexico into the United States. So this is assuming that people who are of Mexican descent are crossing illegally. They deported 1.1 million migrants back to Mexico, and including in these 1.1 millions, some Mexican Americans born in the United States who were U.S. citizens were also caught up. Even as the farm labor shortage existed, the Bracero program, which was going on, which was the way to come into the United States with the approval of both the U.S. and Mexican government, was not providing as many workers as were necessary. And because agricultural workers were working in low-skill jobs, they were often exploited by their employers, being paid less, knowing that there might be other people who come across the border seeking those economic opportunities because economic conditions in Mexico were not as good. That's going to lead to an advocacy group called the United Farm Workers. So this is going to unionize agricultural workers in the Southwest, being led by people like Cesar Chavez. There is going to be continued animus against Mexican American immigrants, especially after the Bracero program ends in 1964. And with the passing of the Immigration Act of 1965, immigration from Mexico is going to go down to 20,000 people per year. So not enough of the amounts of people that should come over and fill those labor gaps. That's going to give rise to a lot of illegal immigration, people coming to the United States without getting proper documentation. All right, for the American Indian movement, this was a response to the Indian Relocation Act of 1956. This was a piece of legislation passed by Congress that was trying to get American Indians to assimilate, get them to go into the cities, pay for some sort of vocational training, and have them live in urban areas. And as we've seen in the past, assimilation policies of the United States with American Indians have not gone to plan. A lot of the time, these American Indians that took advantage of this program ended up being paid low-paying jobs or experienced poverty because of the low-paying jobs that they were able to find. And it was also reducing their ties to their original tribes, so weakening the tribes altogether. The American Indian movement is going to be organized across tribal lines. So that means that you're going to have all different American Indian groups advocating for the same thing. They're using the same tactics as the civil rights movement. For example, they have a larger scale sit-in with the occupation of Alcatraz Island off the coast of San Francisco. Alcatraz, as you may know, was a federal prison that was decommissioned. And in the wording of an old treaty, the Treaty of Laramie, American Indians were essentially entitled to any federal land that had been decommissioned. And so that's why they went over there and claimed it for themselves. They had a massive protest in Washington, D.C. They called it the Trail of Broken Treaties, in which they presented 22 demands for the U.S. government to restore sovereignty and to uphold the past treaties that the United States has entered into with American Indian tribes. And then as we get into Johnson's administration and also Richard Nixon's administration, they are a lot more friendly towards American Indians in that they believe that self-determination should be the policy that the United States takes on in dealing with Indian relations. And so finally, in 1975, under the Nixon administration, we're going to pass the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, and it's essentially going to restore tribal sovereignty to American Indian tribes across the United States. Is going to give them more assistance. So they had a huge success in their mobilization. And going on to Asian Americans, the Immigration Act of 1965 technically helped Asian migration. The Chinese Exclusion Act had been repealed earlier in the 1940s as a response to China's involvement in World War II on the side of the Allies. But it still was not allowing a lot of Chinese Americans or Chinese migrants to come to the United States. With the passing of the Immigration Act of 1965, now they get at least 20,000 migrants every year. And given the requirements that the migrants from China needed to meet in order to be able to come to the United States as a part of those 20,000 visas, they had to be the best educated, the best and most successful migrants from China that would be able to come to the United States. And this leads to the rise of the growth of the model minority myth. This is the idea that Asian immigrants are somehow inherently smarter. But this is just a result of the program that they came to from the United States. The original migrants were highly educated and earned a lot of money, and so that's a cycle that continues with their descendants. The Asian American movement is going to begin in 1968, and this is going to stress Pan-Asian solidarity. So it's not just going to be Chinese or Japanese or Filipino, it's going to be all Asians. Ethnicities and ancestries coming together and asking the government to uphold its legislation that's going to limit discrimination against minority groups. And we have gay and lesbian activism. So feminist and gay and lesbian activists mobilized behind claims for legal, economic, and social equality. The gay and lesbian movement is going to begin in 1969 as a result of a police raid on the Stonewall Inn. The Stonewall Inn was a bar/dance club that was frequented by gay and lesbian women in New York City. And one night the cops in New York City went to this establishment because it didn't have a liquor license, and also went to harass the clientele who were majority gay. This is escalated into riots across Greenwich Village in New York City, where the Stonewall Inn is located. The people inside of the bar were fed up and being harassed for their sexual preference. And so this erupted into the larger gay and lesbian movement. Every year on the anniversary of the Stonewall riots, there is a pride parade trying to destigmatize the homosexuality in the United States, because up until 1974, it was still classified as a mental disorder. And the main objective of the gay and lesbian movement in the 1960s and 70s was to destigmatize homosexuality. They wanted to be openly gay without any discriminatory repercussions. And moving on to feminism. Feminists who participated in the counterculture of the 1960s rejected many of the social, economic, and political values of their parents' generation and advocated changes in sexual norms. This begins with Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique book, which exposes the unhappiness in the domestic role of women. In 1966, Betty Friedan helps co-found the National Organization for Women, which again is going to advocate and lobby for legislation that's going to end discrimination for women and bring women's issues to the forefront, that they are not happy staying at home and being homemakers. Some want to go out into the workforce and get paid the same as men for equal work. Gloria Steinman is another women activist in the 1960s and 70s. She co-founded the National Women's Political Caucus, which trains women and encourages them to run for political office that will allow them to write legislation that's going to advocate for women's needs. There are some successes as a result of this wave of feminism. We have the Equal Pay Act of 1963. Women are covered as a protected class in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And then in 1972, in the Nixon administration, they passed the Title IX, which is amendments to previous legislation that's going to require public institutions to spend the same amount of money on women's programs as in men's programs. So you may be familiar with Title IX in relation to high school and college sports. The Equal Rights Amendment was the biggest push of the feminist movement, which did not get passed or did not get ratified. It is passed by both houses of Congress, yet it does not get the required amount of states to ratify it in the end. And all the ERA was meant to be was a short statement added to the Constitution that would protect women against discrimination. The full length of the amendment is written up here. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. So it's one short sentence, but it would have a huge impact, because then women, anytime that they are discriminated against because of their sex, because they are women, could have a solid case brought up to the Supreme Court in which they could get some reprieve. Now, there were women who did not want the ERA, who opposed the feminist movement, and we're going to talk more about the conservative backlash during this time period in a future lecture. But there was a Stop ERA movement, and the leader of this movement was Phyllis Schlafly. All right, so that was it. Here's our recap. Latinos, American Indians, Asian Americans, women, and the LGBT mobilized using similar tactics to the civil rights movement. And then finally, American Indians and women's efforts achieved legislative victories. All right, so thank you for watching. Please come again to watch the next lecture, and I'll see you then.